The subjunctive is one of 3 grammatical moods in English, along with the indicative mood and the imperative mood. It isn't used very often in English. Some languages, such as Spanish, use it more. Nevertheless, we've been asked to talk about it. So here's a podcast that explains when we use the subjunctive in English, and we'll also share some examples. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hello and welcome, especially if you're a new listener to the podcast. My name's Craig.
And my name's Reza.
And with more than 50, or now it's 60, isn't it, Reza?
60 now.
60 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you doing, mate?
I'm feeling fine. Luckily, I've just got over a bit of a cold. It's that time of year. It's the end of winter here where we are. My throat was a bit croaky yesterday, but I think it'll be okay today to podcast. What about you?
Well, I haven't been well. Last week I was very, very unwell, actually. I thought it was a virus or some kind of flu, but it turns out that it was an infection I caught at the hospital. So you go to the hospital to get tests and to get well, and you come home very, very sick. I think I was unlucky. And I felt bad because I had to cancel classes last week, and I feel that I let down some students. To let down means to disappoint. I felt that they were waiting for the classes and I couldn't teach. I cancelled the whole week of classes. So now I'm 100% well again and ready to podcast and teach. So it has a happy ending.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
First this week, I'd like to say hello to a friend of the show and long-time listener, Manuel Garcia Betagon. Manuel's been listening for many, many years, and he's just turned 92 years old. And I think, like us, Reza, he hasn't been feeling too well lately. So, Manuel, if you're listening, we wish you better. We hope you're feeling better now. And as we've said many times in our emails, in our exchange of emails, hopefully one day you'll be able to come to Valencia and we'll sit down and have a coffee together. So I hope you're well, Manuel.
Yes, we were very proud in our introduction about the 60 years of teaching we have between us. But Manuel, you've been on Earth for 92. Now that's impressive. I bet you've got a lot of good stories to tell us.
First this week, we have a voice message from Rafael from Seville.
Hello, Reza and Craig. This is Rafael from Seville. First of all, excuse my English. I want to congratulate you on your podcast. I usually listen to them when I go out for a walk because I find them entertaining as well as instructive. What more could you ask for learning a language? And if that were not enough, you can listen to Craig's jokes or Reza speaking Spanish with Extremaduran accent. Regarding some of my many doubts, I was thinking of asking you to talk about the use of the verbs in the infinitive and gerund form. But it seems that by telepathy, you have captured it and you have already broadcast it in one of your last podcasts. So instead, could you talk briefly about the use of the subjunctive? I would appreciate it very much. And finally, if this audio is on your comments, is ever included in any of your podcasts, please let me know it so I can listen to it and learn from my mistakes. Well, that's all for now. Thank you for your work.
Well, thank you very much, Rafael, for your lovely message. And it was excellent. There were hardly any mistakes to correct. In fact, you spoke very effectively, very, very clearly, and you spoke very well. And Rafael was speaking about recent podcasts we've done on gerunds and infinitives, some grammar podcasts. If you want to listen to those, we did 3 on that topic, episodes 553, 554, and 555. So just go to inglespodcast.com/ and then the number of the episode, for example, 553. Any comments, Reza?
I would just say the same as you, Craig, that was a very clear message and I understood absolutely everything. And if you can do that, well, then you speak good English. Just one thing though, at the very, very end of your message, Raphael, I think you said something which wasn't right, but it may be the quality of the audio. I'm not sure. I think you may have said that you want to learn for, you said, I want to learn for my mistakes. You may have said that. It should be, I want to learn from my mistakes. So I don't know if you said it incorrectly or not because of the audio, but just to clarify, you should say that you want to learn from your mistakes. So apart from that possible mistake, I didn't hear any other.
No, me neither. It was an excellent message, and thank you for getting in touch. So you asked us to speak a little about the subjunctive in English. So we will do that in this episode, a little bit of grammar for you. The subjunctive is a verb form, a form of the verb, and it's used to speak about hypothetical situations. So those imaginary situations that are hypothetical, like wishes, suggestions, maybe demands, when you demand something, and formal statements. Now, it's not so common in English. In fact, it's less common in English than in some other languages, like Spanish, for example, but we do still use it in some very specific cases, don't we, Reza?
Yes, it's very common when we're talking about imaginary or unreal situations. For example, with words such as I wish or as if, you'll often hear the subjunctive with those words. Not always, but very, very often. But don't worry, there isn't actually an awful lot. An awful lot means very much. There isn't an awful lot to learn. Basically, it looks the same as the indicative, but with a few very, very minor differences. For example, if you think of the past simple of the verb to be, which you probably know, I was, you were, he, she, it was, we were, you were, they were. Well, in the subjunctive, it's the same except take away was. Everything is were. So it's even easier. In the subjunctive, it's I were, not I was, you were, and then he, she, it were, not was, and then everything were. So everything is were. It's as simple as that. So you don't even need to know the word was. That's the only difference. So when you're talking about hypothetical or unreal things, and you use the verb to be, it's going to be were. But everything else is the same. So other verbs actually look the same. It's only the verb to be which has this slight difference.
And most native speakers probably wouldn't even know about the subjunctive, would they? They wouldn't even know that they were using it.
Yeah.
And most of the time, as you say, it is very identical to the indicative.
I reckon if you interviewed people in the streets of the United Kingdom, Ireland, America, any English-speaking country, I reckon at least 85% of people would say, what's a subjunctive? I'm not exaggerating, 85%. They wouldn't know what you're talking about. And even though they might use one in the conversation, they wouldn't know they were using one. They just wouldn't know. They just know that, okay, instead of saying I was, I've said I were here, but no one thinks, oh, that's because it's a subjunctive. We don't really think about subjunctive in English, do we, Craig?
No, it's not used very often. But let's look at some examples for you where we do use the subjunctive. And as Reza said before, we often use it to give advice, speak about unreal situations. And you may have heard the expression, if I were you. If I were you, I would da 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 da. So that's an example of the subjunctive. If I were you, I would take the job. Now we often contract I would, so it becomes I'd. If I were you, I'd take the job. Or if I were you, I'd join one of my conversation courses to improve your spoken English. That's what I'd do if I were you. Can you think of another example, Reza?
Yes, another one with if. If Mary were running the company rather than John, things would be very different. So this sentence is just like Craig's. It's a second conditional. That is if with a past, if I were you, and that's the condition, and the result is would with infinitive, I would take. Well, here instead of a past simple, where, we have the past continuous of the verb run, were running. But notice that the verb to be is were again, not was, because normally in the past continuous we would say, if Mary was running the company. Yeah, was running is what we would normally do in the indicative for the past continuous. But because it's a second conditional, talking about unreal, hypothetical things, then we use the subjunctive. And the only difference is, as we said, instead of was, it's were. So that's why it is. If Mary were running the company rather than John, things would be very different.
In fact, the subjunctive is so not common in English that you may often hear native speakers say, if Mary was running the company. And I think that's so common these days that it's almost accepted as correct, isn't it?
Yeah.
You could say both. Instead of saying, if I were you, if I was you. I've heard that many, many times from native speakers. Here's another example. She acts as if she were the manager. There's the hypothetical use again. So she's not the manager, but she acts or she behaves as if she were the manager.
So in that sentence that Craig just said, hopefully by now you would recognize that there's a subjunctive because you heard the word were with the word she were, and you think, oh, it's normally she was. But Craig said she were, oh, that means it's the subjunctive. Well done. But what about in this sentence? He acts as if he owned the place. He owned is actually a subjunctive. But you're thinking, well, it just looks like the normal past simple, indicative. Yes, but it is a subjunctive. But who cares? Because it looks the same. So when it's a verb which isn't the verb to be, there's no difference. Just use the normal past simple indicative form. It's only when it's the verb to be that you notice a difference when you say I were or she were. Apart from that, you wouldn't even know. So now you can see why English speakers don't know much about the subjunctive. They don't even know they're using it.
Another example, a conditional sentence. If only she were a bit older, she might not act so stupidly. If only she were. So as Reza said at the beginning of the podcast, with if only, with I wish, we often use the subjunctive. If only she were a bit older, she might not act so stupidly. And another example from one of my favourite Pink Floyd songs. You may know this, Reza. I Wish You Were Here.
I do know it, yeah.
I wish you were here, often written on postcards, if you can remember sending postcards back in the day. I wish you were here, having a lovely time. That's also the subjunctive.
So we were talking there about the subjunctive used for hypothetical situations. There is another common use of the subjunctive, and that is for suggestions or requests and also demands. So after certain verbs, you often get the subjunctive. We said suggestions, so after the verb suggest, it's very important. We also said demands, so after the verb demand, it's very common to have the subjunctive. Also recommend, insist, require, which is the verb related to the noun request, ask, and a few other verbs. It also comes after certain adjectives, words like important, necessary, essential, and urgent. With all of those verbs and adjectives, you can use the subjunctive.
Be careful, if you're a Spanish speaker, be careful of the verb demand. It's not demandar. It's a false friend. Demandar is to sue in English, S-U-E. So demand is to make a very, very, very strong request, almost like an order. Now, this is more common, this subjunctive use is more common in formal writing when you're making polite requests. It's more common in that style of English than in informal spoken English. And it's particularly common in American English, isn't it, Reza? The Americans like to use the subjunctive a bit more than the Brits do.
Yes, For formal American English, yeah, not informal, but for formal American English, I identify constructions like we're going to give you examples of in a minute, very much with things like congressional hearings and court cases and things like that. In America, you'll often hear the type of sentences that we're going to give you examples of now. I identify it even more with polite, formal American English than British, in fact.
And one important thing to notice about the subjunctive is that it does not take the S in the third person singular form in the present. So whereas you might say he goes, you're adding the S onto go, goes, or he sits, or he works, or she lives, or she sleeps, for example. So you're adding that S, but not in the subjunctive. For example, let's use the verb suggest. I suggest that he go to the doctor. So not goes, but go. I suggest that he go to the doctor.
However, you can say, I suggest that he goes to the doctor, and it sounds perfectly good as well.
Yeah, that's correct, isn't it?
And it is correct. It's not wrong.
So why would we use a subjunctive? To sound more formal?
More formal, more polite. And as I say, you'll hear it more in American English. I reckon you would actually hear, I suggest that he goes to the doctor. I reckon that's what you'd hear more in British English than with a subjunctive. But in American English, I think you'll hear the subjunctive more. I suggest that he go. That's my theory. I can't prove that, but I would say that you're more likely to hear the subjunctive used that way in American English than British.
A couple more examples for you. It's important that she be on time. It's important that she be on time. And that verb be there is the subjunctive form.
So the subjunctive of the present of the verb to be is, I'll conjugate it for you. I be, you be, he, she, it be, we be, you be, they be. It's the word be. So the present subjunctive of be is be.
Well, that's easy to remember.
Yeah. And you already know the past subjunctive of be is were. I were, you were, he, she. So there's only two words you need to know for be. Present subjunctive be, past subjunctive were. With all the different parts, first, second, third person, singular and plural.
Another example, they insisted that he pay the full amount. That sounds like a formal sentence, doesn't it? They insisted that he pay, notice there's no S on pay, that he pay the full amount.
There are other common verbs and expressions that often trigger. That means they lend themselves, they're perfect for using the subjunctive.
They activate.
They activate,
pause.
exactly. Like a trigger on a gun makes the bullet come out, right? As we already said, the words suggest, recommend, demand, insist, require, and ask, because they're related to suggestions and requests and demands, they're very common with the subjunctive. Also, you got the verb propose and urge. They're also very common. So here's a suggestion, for example. I suggested that she study harder. So rather than saying she studies, which would be the normal indicative, I can use the subjunctive and say that she study harder with the verb suggest.
I bet you've said that to one or two parents of your younger students in the past, haven't you, Reza? I suggest that she study harder.
I have, but I rarely get the response that I'm looking for.
Here's an example with recommend. By the way, you can see all of these example sentences in the show notes to this episode. Go to inglespodcast.com/558. Recommend. My doctor recommends that he drink more water. They always do, don't they, doctors? They like to say, drink more water. So he recommends that he drink more water.
Here's one with demand. The manager demanded that the report be completed by Friday. Remember we said the present form of the subjunctive with the verb be is always be. So instead of the report is completed, with the subjunctive you say the manager demanded that the report be completed by Friday.
Here's an example with insist, the verb insist. She insists that he pay the bill immediately.
Here's one with require. The company requires that every employee wear an ID badge.
An example with ask. The host asks that each guest bring a dish to share. So bring a dish of food to share. The host asks that each guest bring, there's the subjunctive verb there, bring a dish to share.
And here's one last one with the verb propose. They propose that the meeting be rescheduled rather than is rescheduled, that the meeting be rescheduled. Subjunctive.
So those were some verbs that often find themselves being used with the subjunctive: suggest, recommend, demand, insist, require, ask, and propose. There are also some expressions that like to be followed by the subjunctive. Expressions like it's essential that, blah, blah, blah. It's important that, blah, blah, blah. It's necessary that, and it's vital that. So we'll give you one or two examples using these expressions.
So here's one with it's essential that. It's essential that he arrive on time. So I didn't add an S there to the word arrive. I didn't say arrives because I am using the subjunctive. And remember, we take away the S on the third person singular. It's essential that he arrive on time.
Here's one with important. It's important that she understand the instructions.
Here's another one with it's necessary that. It's necessary that he attend the meeting.
And finally, one with vital. It's vital, which means it's really, really important. It's vital that we finish the project by the deadline, which means on the date that we say or before. You could also say it's vital that he finish. So the verb doesn't change. It's the subjunctive. It's vital that he finish the project by the deadline, or even it's vital that Robert finish the project by the deadline. No change to the verb.
So when Craig used the subject we, you didn't even notice that it was a subjunctive because the indicative is we finish and the subjunctive is we finish. So who would know it's a subjunctive? You only know when you use the third person singular, because instead of saying he finishes, indicative, we took away the S and said he finish. So it's only with the third person singular present that you know you're using a subjunctive.
Let's take a quick break here because I know you listen to this podcast to take your English to the next level. But what about your speaking? Is your fluency improving? Are you happy with your speaking skills? My conversation course focuses on making you a more confident and more fluent English speaker. You'll join me and a small group of motivated students, and we'll meet on Zoom and have topical discussions, role plays, debates, and presentations that will expand your vocabulary and help you express yourself effectively in English. So be proactive and take the first step towards becoming a confident and fluent English speaker. Send me an email today to craig@inglespodcast.com and I'll send you details of the next online conversation course. Thanks for listening. Now let's get back to the podcast. So we've spoken about some common verbs that take the subjunctive, some expressions that take the subjunctive. There are also some very fixed expressions, and you may have heard of some of these. They tend to be formal statements and common phrases that we use in English, in modern English, and they have the subjunctive in them. For example, God save the king. Notice it's not saves, it's save. God save the king. But why isn't that imperative, Reza? It seems to me to be an imperative, like you're telling God to save the Queen, like you're telling someone, don't touch, or go to your room, or stop.
It's not exactly an imperative. It's because this is just a theory. No one could say this for sure, but it's a fairly widely accepted theory that it's a short form of may God save the king.
Ah, of course.
May God save the king. So we got rid of the word may, and it's just now God save the king.
That makes a lot of sense.
Or maybe even a shorter version of I hope that God may save the king. And it's got reduced to God save the king. So it isn't actually an imperative. No, it is the subjunctive.
Yeah, that's logical. You've added one here that's very long and formal. Can you read this next one?
Yes, because we said it often appears in formal language, really complicated language, things like legalese. We spoke a few episodes back, about 10 episodes ago, about legal language. Something like this. The contract stipulates that the signatories be fully liable for all expenses incurred. Now, I could have said there that the signatories are fully liable, but by using a subjunctive in a contract, it makes it sound more formal, more legal. Yeah,
more legal.
I could have said are, but it would be more typical to say that the signatories be fully liable. It's stipulated.
Another example, the expression heaven help us or God help us is another example of the subjunctive.
Another very common one is so be it. It means, well, okay, I don't like the situation, but if I have no choice, well, I accept it. But it's much quicker to say, so be it.
Like my mum said to me when I was very young, if Craig wants to spend all his money on beer every week, so be it. I accept the situation, so be it. It's often said in annoyance, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, particularly to show that people are not happy about a situation. Another common one is be that as it may. For example, be that as it may, you won't make me change my mind. Because I said be that as it may, it's a way of saying, okay, although you've made an argument, a case for something, still, I'm not going to change my mind. So be that as it may kind of basically means although something. So although you've made a good argument, you won't make me change my mind. So be that as it may replaces something you could say with although.
Another example with a subjunctive is suffice it to say. In this example, suffice it to say the results were surprising. Suffice it to say. And that means more information is not really necessary. It's enough for me to say this. Suffice it to say, the results were surprising.
Now, if you're a Beatles fan like me, I'm very sure that you know the words let it be. But the Beatles didn't invent that phrase. It's been around for a long time. And it uses a subjunctive. Let it be. Not let it is, but let it be. So be there's a subjunctive. And it means, well, that's the way things are. They are the way they are. We can't change it. Let it be.
When I find myself in times of trouble,
Mother Mary says to me,
speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Let it be. We won't sing, don't worry. Another example, come what may, which means whatever happens. Come what may, I will support you. Come what may, I will always love you. Whatever happens, come what may.
And we've got one more, which these days I think is really only used ironically, and that is, would that it were. Or sometimes people add the word so. Would that it were so.
Or would that it were so simple sometimes.
Exactly. So plus an adjective or an adverb. For example, like that. Craig, I've bought you a present.
Chocolates?
No, I'm afraid it's not.
Oh. Would that it were.
Yes, it's something else. So he would really like it to be chocolate, but it isn't. That's when he said, oh, would that it were.
So be it. Now, it's your turn to practice your English. We would love to hear from you. Do you have an idea for a future podcast? Maybe a grammar point that you would like us to speak about and discuss? Now, if you are thinking of a grammar point or a vocabulary area, please go to the website inglespodcast.com and do a quick search in the search box. Just make sure we haven't spoken about it already, because after 558 episodes, there's a high possibility that we've already spoken about it. But if we haven't, we'd be delighted to help you with your grammar. Reza, how can people contact us?
The best way, we believe, is by leaving us an audio message, and you can do that through SpeakPipe. There's a link in the show notes. It's speakpipe.com/inglespodcast. Do remember, though, that there's a time limit of 90 seconds for audio messages.
And if you prefer writing emails, you can send your emails to me. I'm Craig, Craig, at inglespodcast.com. And also, if you're interested in details about my conversation courses, that's the email to write to me at. If you'd like to reach Reza, write to belfastreza, Reza, at gmail.com.
And in addition to Craig's classes, if you're a Spanish speaker and you want to improve your English with free and also some paid resources online, you can visit the Mansión Inglés website. It's at mansioningles.com. And for specifically paid products, you can also browse the online store. That's at store.mansioningles.net.
And before we say goodbye this week, we'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our wonderful Patreon supporters. And these are people who participate in supporting the podcast on Patreon and also get instant access to the transcriptions of every podcast so that you can read every word that we say. And in addition, more or less once a month, we're doing them. There are also invitations to join me and some lovely people on Zoom to have a very informal chat so that you can practice your speaking. It is very casual. It isn't a lesson. It's just a chat to say hello, how you're doing. We had a lovely conversation back in January with Nacho, with Marcin, and with Carlos. So thank you for attending. You won't hear a lot of subjunctive moods on this Zoom chat because it is very informal, but we'd love you to join if you are a Patreon member. And Reza, who do we need to thank this month?
We need to thank a hell of a lot of people, but I'm afraid we don't have time to say everybody's name. So what we should do and what we will do is what we always do. We will list the people who've recently joined us this month on the Patreon scheme, and they are Mihaila Stramtu. I'm interested to know where that name comes from, Mihaila. Am I right in guessing it's Romanian? Let me know. Mihaila Stramtu, Isabel M, Amparo, Jader Cortes, and Adrian. Thank you to you, the new sponsors, and to all the sponsors who continue to sponsor us.
Yes, thank you so much. We really appreciate you. On next week's podcast, we're speaking about music. We've spoken previously about British music legends, and we did promise, probably maybe 2-3 years ago, we were going to talk about American music legends. So it's been a long time coming, according to the Doobie Brothers. But we will be speaking about American music next week on the podcast. Thank you so much for your company this week. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's bye-bye from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later. And before you go, if you did enjoy this episode, please tell a friend so that more people can listen to us. We'll see you next week.